Do you have a painful relationship with discipline and have a weak willpower? And this causes you to feel bad about yourself because you're not making a lot of progress on some projects that are important to you. Well, the message I want to share in this video is that it doesn't have to be that way. And here specifically, I want to address a mindset shift rather than specific strategies. But yeah, this situation, your painful relationship with discipline, is caused by a misconception you've been given. And I've realized this after a lot of pointless struggle. I learned the hard way, you could say, and hopefully I can help you save some time by offering a new way to look at this. So basically, if you hate discipline, I think it's probably because you've been fed a dysfunctional definition, and then you've been criticized and disparaged because it wasn't working for you. And so the main concept, the crux of this false definition, I'd say, is that discipline is not willpower. That's a common definition that's given, or a common conception in society and the way people usually talk about it, that basically discipline is the same thing as willpower. The thing is, willpower, in my opinion, and as far as I can tell, and I think you can, well, your own mileage may vary, but I think this is the case. Willpower is pretty static. And what I mean by that is that it's kind of an attribute where, maybe your upbringing can have an influence on it, but probably around your teenage years, it's not going to change that much. So if you're good at it, you're good at it. And if you're bad, you're bad. And you're probably not going to change that much, even with practice. I'm not saying you can't improve at all, but I think that you're probably not going to make massive strides. And even in order to get some gains, you're going to need to invest a lot of energy and a lot of time and a lot of practice. And so if your willpower is pretty static and you're unfortunately, unfortunately you happen to have low willpower yourself, then by definition, you're going to be bad at discipline, if that's the definition we're using, right? And so this kind of creates a shame-death spiral where you're set up for failure because the strategy you're given is dysfunctional, but then you get blamed for the poor strategy not working, right? And so it creates this double bind where it gives you the false hope that you can, escape this predicament if only you try hard enough. If you put your back into it, if you make use of willpower, you can actually be good at willpower. But the thing is, it doesn't work. At least that's my premise. But I think it's pretty well documented. So since your willpower is weak, relying on willpower doesn't work. So failure is ineluctable. But then if you fail, right, it's not used. The possibility that the strategy itself doesn't work is never examined, and instead failure means that you didn't try enough, and you're bad, you're a loser. And so whatever happens, no matter how many times you try, it always falls back on you. And the more attempts you go through, the more you go through this cycle, the more crushing and hopeless it gets. And so I think that it's pretty understandable and legitimate if you have a lot of pent-up anger and resentment around the topic of discipline, this kind of general idea, sphere of life. And this is caused by what I think is a dysfunctional cultural myth, kind of a social conception that's pretty prevalent. And I think like a big part of it, right, is this idea that suffering and hustle is virtuous. It's kind of a form of macho sadomasochism. Masochism? The whole idea of like pull yourself by the bootstraps, kind of military style. You never have any fun, always embody austerity, abnegation, self-denial, restraint. This whole cult and fetishization of willpower, and kind of being a glutton for punishment and striving, through it all. But if you think about it, I think this whole framing, I mean, it works for some people, that's the thing, right? And then the people for who it works will give you that advice because it works well for them, but they never consider that it might not work well for other types of people. And if you go through this problem rationally, the goal would be to find the best strategy, given your strengths and weaknesses, right? You kind of factor them in, and then on that basis, you come up with a strategy. Rather than what tends to happen, where you're just told to be different, right? Why can't you just be the desired social standard? The fact that you're different doesn't mean that you need another strategy. It means that you're bad and a failure. And, you just got to beat yourself up for it for your whole life without ever getting any better. I don't think that's a very helpful framing. It doesn't help at all. It's unfair. And so I think it's pretty normal if you feel some indignation, right? I kind of have this perspective that I can kind of accept, some evil. I can accept some incompetence, but you have to choose one. Both at the same time is too much, You got to... And in this case, right, this setup is both harmful because it causes useless suffering, because you're trying to do something you can't do, it's never going to work, right? And then it's also incompetent because it's expecting an obviously flawed solution, so-called solution, to fix a problem, and never readjusting the assumptions despite the copious evidence that it's not working. Now, I mean, I guess my instinct is that when something is not working, I tend to question the strategy rather than, the person going through the strategy. But in any case, if you've tried it for years and it's not working, you probably want to try a different solution. And, you can think about it in this way, with this analogy. Imagine you want to prevent your kids to stick their fingers in an electrical appliance, right? Like an electrical socket. What would you rather do? What do you think is the best option? Do you A, do nothing, but you just demean and shame them every time they get zapped, hoping that this will change their behavior? Or B, you just put some protection over the electrical socket, and this way it's impossible for them to actually put their fingers in there. I would say the second solution is far superior. And so, okay, on this basis, this whole idea that discipline equals willpower is flawed and bad. So what is actually willpower? How would I define it? Well, I would say that, or rather, how would I define discipline? I would say that discipline is not willpower, it's actually wisdom. And to be more precise, I would say that it's a combination of humility and foresight. And so humility is basically accepting that you're a disappointment to the people around you and to yourself, at least in this one regard. You don't have to, I'm saying this kind of jokingly, but basically it's working with how you are rather than trying to deny reality hard enough over and over, right? If you can just deny reality hard enough, you'll finally break through. So it's kind of accepting the current state of affair and working with it, and kind of knowing when to put on the training wheels. And then foresight is just knowing your limits, and so based on the basis of what you've learned through humility, and then making plans in accordance with them, right? So it's basically you want to, instead of relying on willpower, if you know you're weak in certain areas, or you get tempted easily, or you veer off track, then what you do is when you're not in the middle of this kind of challenging situation, when you can kind of rest your head and make a rational, wise decision, you start thinking about how can you set up your environment, create rules of thumbs and processes in advance that allow you to avoid your most common pitfalls, such as procrastination, temptation, and such traps. And another thing I think here is that, or at least something to consider, because I know I kind of struggle with that. If you've kind of gone through this experience, you might associate processes and kind of rules you have to follow as the man, so to speak, a kind of tyrannical, arbitrary source of constraints, and so you may have developed an instinct to rebel against any rule, right? Like, I don't want to be constrained, and so this causes some friction. But the goal of this new definition or mindset about discipline is it's more about wisdom. It's about what's proven through experience to work and not work. So you should be the one crafting your own process, and then iteratively use iterative improvements to, because maybe you come up with an idea and it doesn't work out so good in practice. So then you have to improve it a little bit, change something, see if it works better. But basically, you want to create a good, wise process that works given your the way you work, your strengths, your weaknesses. And then because you've crafted it and you've made a rational process and you've tested it through experience, then you can trust that process because it's not arbitrary. It makes sense. It's when you follow your own best practices, your own rules, that's when you can avoid those traps to the most extent, to the best of your ability. And thanks to that, you can actually start making progress and be productive on projects that you really care about. So that's basically the main idea I wanted to share here. Is mostly a mindset shift. For me, it was pretty important. And it kind of needs some to repeat it a little bit to digest it before you really start internalizing it. So I won't get into specific strategies on how to do this. I'll probably address that in the future. But that's kind of the foundation. And as a general way, I tend to view discipline. So I thought this was an important thing to talk about first. All right, I hope this was helpful. Thanks for listening.